So welcome everyone. My name is Marcelo Gleiser. I am the director of the Institute for Cross-Disciplinary Engagement at Dartmouth, housed here in the Department of Physics and Astronomy. And today we have the pleasure of having our current fellows lecture on Islamic Creationism in Europe. Our fellow is Salman Hameed. He is the Charles Taylor Chair and Associate Professor of Integrated Science and Humanities in the School of Cognitive Sciences at Hampshire College, where he's also the director for the Center for the Study of Science in Muslim Societies. This is the third of Salman's lecture while in tenure here at Dartmouth in the last 6 months or 5 months. His primary research interest focuses on understanding the reception of science in the Muslim world and how Muslims view the relationship between science and religion, which is really the main topic of the lecture today. He recently led a 4-year National Science Foundation study on the reception of biological evolution in diverse Muslim societies. I imagine you're going to give us an overview of that or something related to that today. He's also leading a study to understand and analyze the discourse and participants in online Islamic and science videos. He teaches evolution, Islam and modernity, science in the Muslim world, creating science fiction short films using real science with Dr. Jason Thor, and science and religion, biological evolution in the public sphere, all of them at the Hampshire College. Salman also runs Urtica, a science and religion blog with an emphasis on scientific debates taking place in the Muslim world, and hosts an online astronomy video series in Urdu, Science Ka Ada. You have to tell us what that means later. He also has a weekly segment with morning DJ Monte Belmonte for Northampton radio station, and a monthly segment titled Musings on the Ridiculously Large and Largely Ridiculous Universe on the Bill Newman Show on WHMP. So his lecture today is titled Islamic Creationism in Europe, Biological Evolution in the Service of the Clash of Civilizations narrative. Okay, Salman, welcome.
Oh, there's a
pointer.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and also I want to thank ICE, and again, as you would point, the good ICE, not the bad ICE, for hosting me and for providing me the opportunity to be here to conduct research and to work on a book. And it has been an absolute pleasure being here, so that has been really good. I also enjoyed the 2-day spring we had a couple of days ago before summer started. And so it's been actually, but it's been a pleasure. It's been really amazing, my experience here. So let me start by this topic on Islamic creationism in Europe, but I will give you a broader context as well. So let's, when we talk about Europe, and I was going to say these days, but I think it has been an ongoing thing. Many of the political issues are just ongoing. And so when we look at it, here are a couple of issues that have been in Europe in the news that deal with, to some extent, with Muslims. The top one is the Charlie Hebdo incident, and then there is the issue of the banning of hijab in France, and it is under discussion in a couple of other places as well. And then in Switzerland, there was this issue, there was this campaign of banning minarets of mosques. And so this topic, usually when we talk about science and religion debates, we tend to think oftentimes that the debate is about epistemology. The debate is about whether religion can provide an explanation or whether science is a better way of thinking about it. But actually, in the public sphere, it gets much more complicated. And to a certain degree, we know about it here in the US, where creationism plays a role in oftentimes, in the last, not this past presidential election, but certainly in the previous ones on the Republican side, in the primaries, the question has been asked whether you accept evolution or not. and the answers have been usually muddled, because people don't want to take a stand. So there is certainly, this issue is in the public sphere. But the reason I placed these particular pictures out there is because what I'm going to argue here is that biological evolution, its acceptance and rejection, is playing in larger debates in Europe when it deals with Muslims. Okay, and so that will be the argument that I'm making, and that's where. So let's talk about what do we know of what's going on in Europe. This is a picture of a meeting from the European Council. This was from 2006. A report came out in 2007. There was a meeting in which they talked about education. So this was the education department of the European Council. And one of the places where they highlight that is a danger to European education is Islamic creationism. And in particular, there is a book that she's holding, which is the Atlas of Creation. This particular Atlas of Creation, I'm going to mention it later as well. This was sent free of cost to schools, public schools in France, by a creationist from Turkey. His pen name is Harun Yahya. His actual name is Adnan Oktar, and I'm going to talk a little bit about him. But certainly, so here is a meeting where she's carrying this book and she's highlighting, look, this is a danger, and things like that. But then you also have headlines like this, where Muslim medical students boycotting, this is from 2011, boycotting lectures on evolution. Okay, so this is in England. There is a headline over there. And then you have London imam subjected to death threats for supporting evolution. So certainly when you look at this, because first we have to establish whether there is an issue or not. Okay, so when we see there is an aspect of a discussion about education, then we are looking at, well, maybe students are walking out, and then there is an actual death threat. And also please note that the image they are using underneath is women in full niqab. Okay. And then here is from Vancouver Sun. I just picked up sort of like, just a random newspaper headline because it sort of like depicted the broader picture, which says evolution rejected by hundreds of millions of Muslims and evangelicals. Okay, so hundreds of millions. So the question is that, how do we make sense of all of that? So I'm going to talk about today on 4 key points. The first one is, well, is there a single Islamic position on evolution? Then I'm going to talk about, is Islamic creationism on the rise in UK and in Europe, because some of the headlines that I showed. And then how can we account for Islamic creationism in UK and Europe? And then towards the end, I'm going to talk about, well, what is at stake when we are talking about these issues? So let's start with, is there an Islamic position on evolution? And obviously, one of the first questions that comes in is that, which Islam are we talking about? Are we talking about Sunni? Are we talking about Shia? Are we talking about the various Ahmadis? Are we talking about Nation of Islam here? There are many variations of Islams. But then you also have to ask this question, is there a unitary position, especially when we look at the Muslims are pretty much present in all parts of the world. I'm not 100% sure, Antarctica is not included, but there is a possibility that over there may be Muslims as well. So when we are talking about, is there a single position, Islamic position, we have to ask this question, well, where are we talking about? Which Islams are we talking about? Or do we expect to have one single monolithic Islam? So, well, short answer is no. But but I will still go further and say, but we can at least look at what is the narrative of creation stories in the Quran. Okay, and so, well, generally in the Quran, there's no specific details. Like, for example, in the book of Genesis, you have chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, in which there is a conversation about how the world was created. Okay? And even there is a debate about how do you interpret that. But in the Quran, there is no one specific place where the discussion surrounds on the creation of species or on origins of species. But it's mentioned usually in some other context. So for example, here is one example. Surely your Lord is Allah who created the heaven and the earth in 6 periods of time. Okay, so this is similar to the 6-day creation, which is familiar to the Judeo-Christian tradition as well. Now, in the US, the most prominent form of creationism is young earth creationism. That doesn't mean that there are old earth creationists here as well. But young earth creationists are those who believe that the world was created in 6,000 years or less, or 6 to 10,000 years old. And for me, that actually is not a problem of biology. That is actually a problem of geology. Because once you assume that the world is 6 to 10,000 years old, then logically what follows is that you cannot have evolution, because you just simply don't have enough time to evolve species. Okay? So in that context, the formation of that logic then comes in that species were created instantaneously. Now, in the Muslim context, I'm going to make one general statement about it. I did mention there's a broader variations in Muslim societies, that the length of days, even in the Quran itself, is ambiguous. It is a 6-day creation, but at one place in the Quran, it's mentioned that the day, a measure could be, at one place it mentions thousands of years, which you can count, and another place it says it could be 50,000 years. Now, what it does is, in some sense, is that Muslims have sort of, and again, this is one of the few places where I'm making a more generalized statement, sort of assume that, well, if there is one thing that is definitely not specifically mentioned in the Quran, it's the age of the earth, because it explicitly talks about ambiguity. And so in the absence of this absolute information, where do you look for answers? And that is to science. So young earth creationism, which is the most dominant form here in the US, is pretty much absent in the Muslim world, more or less overall. Incidentally, the only place where it sputters up, I mean, I've done interviews and some people have done other survey work as well. It occasionally shows up and people are just confused. But the other place where it has shown up, and we haven't done it here in the US, but a collaborator of mine, Anil Asgar, she did that in Canada. And in Canadian Muslim schools, young earth amongst Muslims becomes more prominent. A beautiful example of how culture can influence things. But in general, in Muslim societies, it is not there. Okay, now, what about sort of like more specific about biological creation? Well, similarly, there is no general discussion, detailed discussion about biological species as well. So here is one example where there is a mention. So for example, who made good everything that he has created, and he began the creation of man from dust. Now, that's about it. Right? So, you know, and again, in the context, even with the creation of the story of the creation of Adam, it's usually the issues are of free will or something else, and then it is in that context as well, we created Adam. So there is no single verse from the Quran that explicitly contradict evolution. Now, it depends on interpretation. It says, well, we created. So some people do take that as this is an actual creation, it's not evolution. But you can also imagine that since it's being created from dust, some people also can interpret it as through a process, gradual process of evolution or something like that. Okay. But when we have done interview work with that, we don't find that even when people reject evolution, there rarely is the case where people actually refer to a specific verse from the Quran. They don't say, aha, here is the verse that rejects it. In fact, it's much broader story, well, Adam and things like that. And I'm going to come back to it in a little bit. Now, there is an interesting argument that some Muslims make in terms of rejecting evolution, and that is that there is a mention of animals in the Quran. There is a chapter called the cow, there is a chapter called the bee, honeybee, and there's a chapter called the spider. And so some people, and I just find it interesting as an argument, so some people have used that as an argument against evolution because, and here is the logic goes, Quran has been always there and will always be there. And so if Quran is mentioning species, they must have been formed as they are. They could not have gone through different stages. And hence, species don't change. Interesting argument, but it's sort of like, with some people, they make that argument. I just wanted to mention it because I just find it an interesting interpretation of that. Okay. But there is another place where we can look for. It's like, okay, so we know there are textbooks. Biology is taught in schools everywhere. So how is evolution presented? So here is just a brief example. In Saudi Arabia, and actually also in Oman, there is explicit creationism. Evolution is considered as a bad, faulty idea. Darwin himself is presented as an atheist, and it's rejected. Turkey, there's some creationism, and Turkey is one of those places where there has been, for the last 30 years or more, there has been a constant back and forth in terms of how you represent evolution in textbooks. But then Iran, Malaysia, and Syria, I don't know what's going on in Syria right now, but overall, evolution is presented over there pretty much in a straightforward way. And in Pakistan, it's interesting that it is presented, however, it is justified with religious references. So for example, here is a page from a 10th grade biology textbook from 12th grade biology textbook from Pakistan, and here is a chapter on evolution, but it starts with a Quranic verse up on top. It's a general Quranic verse that life started from water. Okay. Nevertheless, it's there. Rest of the chapter, actually, there isn't much discussion at all of religion. And in fact, it presents evolution as a fact of science. In another province in Pakistan, they go and actually spend a couple of pages looking at the Quranic conceptions of origin of life and origin of species, and then it concludes, well, there is no contradiction with the scientific view, and then the second section starts and says, scientific view of evolution. And they start by saying, now that we have seen there is no contradiction, let's talk about the scientific perceptions of evolution. But it's an ongoing thing. So just a few months ago, so this, I had a chapter here, I had a paper here in 2014, but just a few months ago, actually in Pakistan, there is, in one of the provinces which is up near the Afghan border, which is called the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, over there, they just removed evolution. In just one province. And in fact, now there is creationism in there. And again, evolution is presented as a Western idea and a wrong idea and so on and so forth. So again, even when we are looking at within the same country, we have these variations that are present over there. Now, I should mention that human evolution in almost all cases is simply ignored. It's just not mentioned. So for example, in Pakistani textbooks, you would go to evolution, you would talk about evolution as a fact of science, but then, and there will be mentions of homologies, there are similarities between humans and others, but then the next chapter is not going to be on human evolution, but rather it's going to be about ecology or reproduction or some other thing. Now, it is important to note that human evolution is not explicitly rejected, it's just simply ignored. It's just not mentioned. So again, one point that I want to mention here is that the diversity of positions, as I mentioned, that how do we think about it, it is also present in the official stance of various Muslim governments. So it is not simply about that, but it's also, there are variations between the governments. So let me very briefly show you some of the results from my own interviews. So I conducted interviews in 6 countries. And those were specifically focused on physicians, Muslim physicians, and medical students. And again, the key point here is to look at whether there is a unitary position for Muslims or not. And so this just gives you an idea. Here is just a big, basic question. Do you personally accept biological evolution or not? And so these were close to about 100, these results are from 150 interviews. And as you can see, well, a little less than a half actually did accept. Many people rejected, pretty sizable fraction. And there are also a bunch of people who are actually somewhere in the other category, meaning to say, even if you ask this question, do you personally accept or reject evolution, you may not get a straightforward answer. Okay? Now, we can actually do this other because those were based on interviews. And just to give you an idea, I mean, people would say, give answers like, well, I accept it scientifically, but I reject it religiously, right? Things like that. So there are variations of that. And here is, again, from 5 countries here I have highlighted, Pakistan, these were in Pakistan, Malaysia, Turkey, then Pakistanis in UK, and Pakistanis in the US, okay? Now, the way they are coded is that blue is the people who said yes to this question, do you personally accept evolution or not? Red is people who said they rejected, and then yellow is that they were other. So if you look at it, Pakistan, a broader majority, actually more than half, accepted evolution. In Malaysia, however, the fraction goes actually pretty low, and a vast majority actually rejected it. In Turkey, and then Pakistanis in UK and US actually more or less half, a little more than that, accepted evolution. So, but again, this is just a question of, do you accept evolution? Okay, and it can mean many different things. So let me go to a much more specific question about human evolution. And the question was, this particular place is coded by this specific question that, are humans a product of evolution from prior species? Okay, wordings actually matter quite a bit. And so, so this was a very specifically worded question. And as you can see, we do not see something like a blanket rejection of human evolution. Yes, not a majority accepts human evolution, but nevertheless, a sizable fraction, about a little less than a third, do accept human evolution as well. Okay. Now, it is blue coded, so blue coded in the same way that these people had responded yes to the question of whether do you personally accept evolution or not. Interestingly, you also see a little bit of red also, meaning to say that when we ask that question, do you personally accept or reject theory of evolution, they said no. And then we get the answer to, are humans a product of prior species? Yes. Okay, so there is a whole other work that I've done, and I have a paper on that which actually looks at this particular aspect of how people respond in a dual manner. Okay, and when you come to the questions like human evolution, that duality becomes even more pronounced. And if there are questions, I can actually talk about that later. Nevertheless, pretty much everybody who said that they didn't accept evolution, map onto they didn't accept human evolution either. So, I mean, in some sense, their rejection is tied to human evolution. Okay, and this is just by country, I just wanted to show you sort of like, the same question about human evolution across the 5 different sites that I did. Interestingly, I just want to highlight Turkey. So again, blue is coded where they answered just to regular evolution, the question is yes. Everybody who said yes to evolution also said human evolution. And everybody who said no to evolution actually said no to evolution as well. So anyway. And Malaysia, by the way, I should just highlight, there's only 1 person out of 30 that we interviewed over there who said yes to human evolution. We did not expect that, but that's the case. Okay. So I'm setting this context because I wanted to show you those diversities, those varieties of answers in order to look at what's going on in Europe. Okay. So the question is that, is Islamic creationism on the rise in Europe? And here are some of the news coverage. So in 2006, creationist leaflets were distributed during Islam Awareness Week. And I'm mentioning those as news items specifically because these are newsworthy things that newspapers have thought we should report on. Okay. So creationist leaflets were distributed in Islam Awareness Week in 2007. There was Atlas of Creation, as I mentioned, that was being brought up. In 2008, University College London, its Islamic student organization hosted a creationist lecture, which is a huge controversy. I'm going to come back to it at the end of this talk. And then Michael Rees, who was for a while an advisor to, I think, to the education in the UK. And he was quoted in 2009, what the Turks believe today is what the Germans and British believe tomorrow. It is becoming, it is because of the mass movement of people between countries. So very specifically talking about immigration and it can actually impact evolution acceptance. And then, of course, in 2011, I've already mentioned Imam threatened over Darwinist views, and then Muslim students boycott evolution lectures. In 2004, in Holland also, there was this news that Muslim biomedical students wrote creationist essays. Okay. So looking at that, it may seem that there is a lot of stuff is happening. Okay. How do we think about this? There are these items that have been reported in the newspapers, and the European Council has looked at it. So how do we look at it? So why are, that's a valid question, why are some, most, we don't know, but Muslims in Europe rejecting evolution, and whether it's an issue of scientific misunderstanding or something else. So I want to, first of all, put in a little bit of context regarding Muslims in Europe. So again, as I mentioned earlier on, we cannot treat Muslims as a monolithic entity in general around the world. But in Europe as well, there is a specific immigration history to it. And so part of it was there were different phases of immigration post-World War II. Many of the Muslims in places like France, UK, and in Germany, the places where they have the highest number of Muslim populations in there, they were part of the reconstruction effort. But Muslims are coming from different places. So there are Turks, predominantly Muslim immigrants in Germany. You have South Asians, in particular, in the UK. And then you have Algerians and Moroccans in France. And I've already shown you that attitudes to evolution are different in different countries. So to expect that everything would be the same, well, that begs the question, whether should it be the same or not? Now, there is a possibility, and I should also mention about the Michael Rees quote. It's not about immigration, because more than half of the Muslim population in Europe actually was born in Europe. So to say that it's they coming in, actually that's a problematic narrative. Okay. Secondly, in Europe there is a possibility that there is something more going on than simply their connections to their native countries. And that is the idea of acculturated Islam. So this is by French scholar Olivier Roy, and he talks about that when the first generation comes in, they are actually linked to their countries. But second and third generations usually lose their cultural connection to their countries. However, and that is part of what's going on in Europe, Islam or religious identity sometimes become more prominent. So this is something that Islam or in the religious identity becomes acculturated. It's not connected to the Islam that they came in, but it just becomes a much more independent, without its cultural reference context. And he finds that second and third generation Muslims identify with Islam more than the first generation of immigrants. Okay? So again, so if we are thinking about the immigrants, I mean, the first generation is not the one actually who feel much more. And that is one of the keys that I will be talking about in a few minutes. But there is another component that we have to take into account, and that is about the socio-economic conditions of the Muslim population in Europe. For better or for worse, the conditions are that highest levels of unemployment is amongst Muslims. In fact, if you just look at the UK, it is 3 times higher than any other group. Okay? Then you also have that Muslims are mostly concentrated, and that has to do a historical context, but concentrated in poor urban locations. So you can imagine, for example, the kind of schools that are present over there and the opportunities they have. And that ties into low enrollment in secondary and post-secondary levels of education. And it's a very young population. You have more than half under the age of 30. Okay? So when we are talking about evolution rejection in Europe, when we are thinking about the reasons for that, I mean, those socio-economic factors actually play an important role. Now, I mentioned about the acculturated Islam. Part of the reason why this happens, part of the reason is that it may be linked to their Muslim identity. Now, this is Jocelyn Cesare, and she writes that self-identification as a Muslim is, in many cases, a consequence of ethnic solidarity maintained or preserved by the socioeconomic conditions of segregation. So if you are living in, for example, in a place in the urban centers, you are segregated. A lot of the neighborhoods are segregated, especially there were Paris riots a few years ago that was in the outskirts of Paris and so on and so forth. So avoiding the stigma attached to segregation requires dissociating from the dominant culture as far as possible, claiming the stigmatized identity and inverting it into a positive attribute. Now, she was talking about more or less in the context of hijab debates, okay, because she was saying that because hijab became a major symbol of Muslims of difference, what marginalized communities do is that take that symbol and appropriate that, because that is what makes them different from the dominant culture. Okay, so here, the places where these kind of debates take place are public institutions. That is why public schools, for example, become a major point of conflict because, so for example, with hijab in France, because you want to assert your identity, if there is a clash that defines where you are versus the dominant culture, however it is being defined as. And so if Muslims are defined as something other, then some Muslims are going to take on that particular identity that is being given to them, particular variables that are given to them, and use that. Okay. You also have issues of prayer in workplaces, also issues of fasting in workplaces, and so on and so forth. And it is, my argument is that it is in this context that biological evolution sometimes show up. Okay. So evolution then can be seen as a contested marker. It can be seen as linked potentially to secularism, because many people argue that, make that argument, and it is associated with the dominant culture. And if you want to look at one of the examples, it's Richard Dawkins, for example. Richard Dawkins is the most famous scientist right now to a certain degree, and he's also a biologist. His books are on evolution. So here is a headline in the Telegraph. Richard Dawkins attacks Muslim schools for stuffing children's minds with alien rubbish. You see, alien is actually an important word because it is specifically saying that this is something other. This is something different. Although, if you want to know the irony of that, the subheading is, Richard Dawkins claims Muslim schools are having a pernicious influence on children who are having their minds stuffed with alien rubbish, such as claims the world is only 6,000 years old. And I've also already mentioned, actually, amongst Muslims, 6,000-year-old is one thing that is not actually common at all, okay? But we don't need information or knowledge, actual what's going on, in order to get specific headlines. This is a headline, right? So you can imagine if you are in Europe, as you are a Muslim, you can actually see, okay, so this idea of evolution, and especially Richard Dawkins as a pronounced atheist as well, calling the ideas of Muslims as alien, all of that would make the argument, well, maybe. The dominant culture, they accept evolution, we don't. In England in particular, that is the case because, so this is the Bishop Wilberforce and Huxley debate. There's a famous debate that happened in 1860. And it was about evolution. The Darwin's book, Origin of Species, was published in 1859. And then right the next year in Oxford, there was this famous debate which kind of marked, in some sense, one of the boundaries of science versus religion. Although those are really problematic boundaries because that is not the case. There were a lot of clergymen at the meeting itself that accepted evolution. There were a lot of natural philosophers who rejected it. Nevertheless, this Huxley, which was also known as Darwin's bulldog, and Wilberforce, who were against evolution, that became sort of like a big debate in England. And in fact, it is true that evolution, more than anything else, stands for science versus religion clash, even though it's not simple, it's problematic. Nevertheless, it is used a lot, and also in some sense, evolution was the topic that played into the role in the formation and the professionalization of science itself in the late 19th century. The science became professionalized in the 19th century, and evolution was one of the topics that did that. Okay, and of course, if you are in England, you are also going to find, or you would have found Darwin on a 10-pound note. So you are already talking about evolution. You want to differentiate yourself, and here is the dominant cultural symbol. He is now being replaced with Jane Austen, which is cool too. But I'm pretty sure that it's still in circulation. Okay, I should put an asterisk in there about U.S. exceptionalism, because of course in the U.S. it's a different thing. Right, so here's a cartoon where Jesus and Darwin are fighting with each other, and of course you also have Time, which says evolution wars, right? So this is different from all the concerns about the European Council to a certain degree about Muslim immigration. It's an alien idea and things like that, but here it's an internal debate, right? Okay, so there is a threat and fear of assimilation to a certain degree. As Muslims who go over there, you might think that if you go to a public education, like, you know, my values are being assimilated or not? You are holding on to some form of identity. And so here, on top of that, this is from 2014. It was this education secretary who said nurseries are at risk of being taken over by religious extremists. The education secretary warned, as she announces, that the toddlers are to be taught fundamental British values. Okay, toddlers. So I have a 4-year-old, and he was a toddler very recently, and I'm not sure what you would have thought, but although being a terrorist, I mean, I think a lot of toddlers do seem like it, and you cannot negotiate with them. You lose. So what are those fundamental British values? Well, one of the things that she said, that nurseries that teach creationism as scientific fact would be ineligible for taxpayer funding under the new rules, because she considered acceptance of evolution as a fundamental British value. Okay? So we are in that context looking at these identity battles. Now, the Harun Yahya, the creationist that I mentioned, he responded to all of these things in a different way. He says, aha, of course. And Richard Dawkins had a campaign, I think about 5-6 years ago, about in the double-decker buses. And he says, God doesn't exist. He had to actually modify it, and he had to actually put in probably, because of the British rule, something about the exact statements. And so he had to say, God probably doesn't exist, so enjoy your life. Okay, there was a big campaign about it. Well, so Harun Yahya, who has plenty of money, he's a creationist, he put this thing, God exists, okay, on the double-decker buses. But why is he doing that? Well, he is trying to make news, and already, this is the Atlas of Creation. It's, by the way, this big book. It's pretty heavy. It's a good doorstopper, okay? And there is nothing credible scientifically in it, but there are big pictures in it. Well, he sent these books in 2007 free of cost. They just showed up at French public schools. And there was a major panic. It is true. There was a panic in French public schools. They're like, whoa, 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 whoa. Religious books just suddenly showed up, and that made a lot of news. This is from the journal Science, reporting on that in Europe's mailbag, a glossy attack on evolution. Okay. Now, 2 years later, he also sent it to various anthropology and biology departments here in the US, and then he made it into the New York Times. Okay. Now, of course, everybody says that he's nuts. This is crazy. Okay. Everybody says that. And that's a key point, because he points out that everybody says that. He says, look, everybody is talking about me. This is from his own website, from Harun Yahya's website, that points out all the papers, Guardian, the New York Times, the National, that they are all mentioning me as the leading Islamic creationist. We must be doing something right. Okay. That is him, yes. He looks like a villain from Miami Vice. Yes, and he always dressed like that. Now, within the Turkey, I'm not going to talk about that, but within Turkey, he has his own other context, and people don't take him seriously. But evolution is a topic where in Europe and in the US, people take seriously because it stirs up emotions because evolution stands for something more than simply evolution. So he plays into that and he figured it out and he started sending stuff to Europe and the US, and it all made news, and then it shows up here. Okay, but I want to first give all the caveats. We've been talking about it, but not all European and British Muslims reject evolution. Okay, we don't know how many do because we only hear about it when somebody rejects evolution. We do not, it's not a news item. This is called confirmation bias. It's not a news item when somebody accepts evolution. It's like, yeah, fine. So we only hear about it when they reject it. Similarly, the notion of Muslim identity varies as well. You don't have just single identity. And in fact, it's a mistake to think that Muslims only identify themselves as Muslims only. You can be a Manchester United fan, and so you hear your identity is a Manchester United fan. You can sort of like, you have all these various identities. You can be from a Londoner, and you'll be like, yeah, I've been a Londoner, right? So again, to just pin that aspect as a Muslim identity is problematic in itself. Okay, so now in the last section, I want to talk about, okay, so I presented these complexities, but the question is that what is at stake in a broad manner? So first the question is that what is being rejected? So even when I asked the question, I mean, I did interviews. And I should mention that most of the claims that people have made about Islamic creationism or the newspaper articles and things like that, they are not based on any kind of deep studies. They are usually based on anecdotes, very small samples. So in actuality, and even I did interviews with a very small number of people. So we actually we don't have much information about what is going on in Europe. Now it's changing because some of my collaborators are actually working on that, but it's still pretty new. So the question is that when you ask evolution, what does it even mean? And it can mean many different things. So one thing that I mentioned, it could be the identity formation and the fear of assimilation by the dominant culture. And so you want to pull back and say, oh, evolution, that's not who we are. So for some, rejection of evolution becomes the definition of being a Muslim, meaning to say that as part of being a Muslim, one of the things we do is reject evolution. Now, that is not the case in other places. But in Europe, it happens with some. They actually respond in that particular way. And again, there are reasons for that. And again, this is very similar. There's a parallel to hijab controversies where Muslims start taking hijab, which they were not taking before, because to assert their Muslim identity. Okay. But of course, there is a difference between micro and macro evolution. As I mentioned, the human evolution question is different than just micro evolution. So what does evolution mean? For some people, evolution means atheism. Then there is, for some people, there is a raw emotion related to social Darwinism. Racism is linked with social Darwinism. Many Muslims face racism in Europe, and so they actually blame to that. And then there is, of course, there is a popular misunderstanding of human evolution as well, that, well, I've never seen a monkey turn into a man. And by the way, if you think that's a crazy thing, I have actually gotten in my interviews answers like that. I don't believe in evolution because I've never seen a monkey turn into a man. And you go like, okay. And I should also mention, sometimes there are reverse answers also. I had the occasion where like somebody accepted evolution because they thought that in the past there is a mention like, that humans turned into monkeys. And I'm like, okay. So sometimes so just because you accept evolution doesn't mean that you accept it for the right reasons either, okay? So, but the problem and the broad stake comes in when evolution and science are used in the clash of civilizations narrative. So for example, Richard Dawkins I've already mentioned, but let me give you a few more tweets. Again, Richard Dawkins, the most prominent biologist, he tweeted in 2013, all the world's Muslims have fewer Nobel Prizes than Trinity College, Cambridge. They did great things in the Middle Ages though. Okay, now, on the fact of it, and he defended himself, I'm not saying, I just presented a fact. But of course, it ignores the whole context. And there is a particular point that he's trying to make, which you can guess what, right? And then there is another one. Of course, you can have an opinion about Islam without having read Quran. You don't have to read Mein Kampf to have an opinion about Nazism. Okay? Now, again, if you were to parse out and send Sean Spicer to defend that, he would say, well, I mean, like, look, he didn't say anything wrong in terms of the two statements, but of course, two statements put together, he is referring to Islam connected to Nazism, to a certain Quran linked with Mein Kampf. Here is another evolutionary biologist here in the US, Jerry Coyne, whose blog, Why Evolution is True, has a section of Muslims behaving badly, has one of the segments in it. And here he writes, I'd prefer religious defeat. This is, he was referring to Pakistan military trying to do polio vaccinations, and polio workers were being attacked in the northern areas near Afghanistan border. And he said, I'd prefer religious defeat, i.e. the disappearance of Islam, but that won't happen anytime soon. In the meantime, it is pretty clear that without religion, we'd have no polio. Religion not only poisons everything, but infects everything as well. Okay. Now, what is interesting about this particular one, this particular quote, is that the vaccination problem became a big issue. It was almost eliminated in Pakistan. Part of the reason why the Taliban actually started to attack, or part of the reason, was because the CIA used a cover of vaccination program to obtain a DNA sample from the compound of Osama bin Laden. It was a fake vaccination program in which they did give one dose of vaccination to the kids in that area, not the follow-up. So if you are talking about ethical issues, the CIA said, hey, look, we are only interested in confirming the identity of Osama bin Laden. And in the process, if we are going to endanger the lives of all the children we are going to give them half of the vaccinations, that's okay. And if we are going to later endanger the lives of the volunteers in the polio campaign, that's okay, right? And now to flip that, and Jerry Coyne uses that and links that to Islam, even though it's the Pakistani military, which is the Muslim military, which is also trying to do a polio vaccination campaign. Now, I've been working here, and so that's where the ICE aspect comes in. I've been working here, and I'm going to give you some British quotes. The quotations that I have given, and I have many, many more. I mean, I haven't even touched Sam Harris, for example. They are actually not so different from 100 years ago. And I've been working on here looking at the late 19th and early 20th century in terms of evolution perceptions. And so here is a quote from Thomas Macaulay in Minute on Education. And you will find some close parallels to what Richard Dawkins is saying. And in 1835, he says, I'm quite ready to take the Oriental learning math, the evaluation of Oriental learning to match, actually, the evaluation of the Orientalists themselves. I've never found one among them who could deny that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. Okay. And then you have W.W. Hunter writing in 1871, and he says, the luxuriant religions of Asia shrivel into dry sticks when brought into contact with the icy realities of Western science. Okay. So what we are seeing in Europe, it's not something out of the ordinary. This is actually a continuation, and you can see that at that time was used as a justification for colonization. Okay. And here is E.H. Nolan writing in the Illustrated History of the British Empire in India, on all scientific subjects, and he's talking about the Quran, contents are absurd, puerile, and superstitious. Discoveries in science or socio-economics are adverse to the fixed principles of this standard. They are therefore rejected by the true believer as infidel. Turkey exhibits the impossibility of a Mohammedan state advancing in the arts and in good governance, even under the most favorable conditions. So you can find similarities in what Richard Dawkins was tweeting, for example, what Jerry Coyne is saying, what Sam Harris has been saying, and these folks who were saying these things actually 100, 150 years ago. Okay. So there are these good parallels at that time. Colonization was based upon this superiority, which, and as you can see, science often is in the narrative. Superiority of Western thinking in that context, whatever it means, like, is in that narrative. Okay. So how does it show up? So let me give you a particular case study at the end of an actual example. I'm going to go through that of how it features in. So this is biologist Steve Jones, very prominent British biologist, and he's at University College London. And he's the one actually who was responsible for that news headline. He was being interviewed in 2011 in the London Times, and it was a long interview on the general state of education in England. And he said about other things, but then he mentioned in the middle of the interview, this was not at the top, this was not the key point, but in the middle of the interview he mentioned Muslim students are boycotting lectures about evolution because they conflict with their blah, blah, blah. Now he explicitly said, it is a minority of students, but the problem is definitely there, and it is definitely growing, said Jones, who teaches introductory genetics to about 300 first-year students, about a fifth of whom are Muslims. The headline that the Times chose was Muslim students boycott lectures on evolution. Now he explicitly said it's not even a minority, it's a minority of them, not all. Nevertheless, that was the headline. Then a few days later, because, and by the way, that was covered all over the world. That particular article and that particular headline made news all over the world, including in Muslim world as well. Many Muslim countries use the same headline. Okay. A few days later, he wrote, Stephen Jones, at University College London, we have numbers of Islamic students, almost all dedicated, hardworking, and able. Some unfortunately, so you say, some unfortunately refuse to accept Darwin's theory on faith grounds, as do some of their Christian fellows. The headline, Islam, Charles Darwin, and the denial of science. Okay. So just look at it, this phrasing, and also I should mention, it's not based on any study. It's not based on any, he's a scientist. This is just his anecdote. And even in his own class, he doesn't have any numbers that he's talking about. But the headline is this, and the other headline is that. So it again, when you talk about in Europe, Muslim rejection of evolution, it plays into a much broader context, as we have seen about the quotes from the threat from immigration, the European Council being worried about it, and things like that. So it's a broader context that it plays a role in it. It plays into this narrative which has been established for the last 100, 150 years of Muslims as backwards and against science and things like that. Okay. So where does it show up? It does show up in the US too. It was also showed up in English Defense League. The right-wing groups in Europe picked on that. And so did the right-wing groups, the anti-Islam groups here in the US. This is a headline from Jihad Watch. UK, Muslim students including trainee doctors walking out on lectures. And it talks about, well, this is, the collective action is an attempt to bully universities into modifying their curricula. Okay. Now, so it was also reported by multiple right-wing blogs. And so did Harun Yahya. Remember the creationist? He also picked it up and he said, that's great. He says, Darwinist panic in England. The Darwinist panic is, in England is on the rise as students are boycotting, and we are winning this battle. Okay. So you can see that this particular issue is now being picked up from both sides. It benefits both extremes because it fits into their own narratives. But both of those narratives are divorced from the actual reality. Okay. And so I will end with this other news item that I had mentioned, and that was that at UCL in 2008, there was a creationist lecture that was organized by the Islamic organization, student organization over there. And that was a big event. Now, when I was doing interviews in England with Muslim Pakistani medical students, I just happened to have one of my interviewee, the person who organized that lecture. And I talked to her, and it was absolutely fascinating. Because when I talked to her, she said, I was like, why did you organize this lecture? And she says, well, we were teaching, we were being taught evolution, and it was not an issue, but we had heard about this evolution and religion debates. So all we wanted to do was to hear, is there a Muslim position on evolution? So we went to the internet, and we typed in Islam and evolution. And the top person that came up was Harun Yahya. And so we contacted him. He said, okay, we hear about evolution from all these things. We want to just get what is the Muslim perception on evolution is. And they accepted it. Now, Harun Yahya's representative was coming. Now, they said, we thought a lot of people would be there. So we asked the university what is the biggest hall you have? We wanted to reserve that, and they did. Now, incidentally, at UCL, the largest auditorium is called Charles Darwin Hall. Okay, now that became a big thing of controversy. Newspapers picked up, and this is like, here are creationists coming in, and they are giving a lecture in the Charles Darwin Auditorium. Okay, now these students, their perception was they were just going to just hold this, and that's about it, right? But then faculty members and students, other students, held protests against this event. And when I talked to her, she's, I think she was 19 or 21, I forgot how old at that time she was. And she says, we never disrespect our professors. And it was just weird. We were just thought we were having this event, and our professors were walking against us, protesting against our event. So when I asked her what happened at the event, and she said, well, what was the reaction of the Islamic Medical Association of Society, and here's the colored part. He says, I mean, I was involved in the Islamic Society. Some people thought it was really good. She thought the talk was, by the way, bad. She thought because we know more about evolution and these guys don't know, the creationists. But she said, because of the press coverage, it drew in a big audience, and the audience were very disappointed. They were like, it doesn't make any sense. Their arguments don't make any sense. And so a lot of non-Muslims came as well, and they were disappointed. I brought some people and friends as well, and overall, everyone was quite disappointed. But there were a few people that loved it. It was very mixed, but a majority of people thought the talk went badly. Badly enough that when they tried to redo a talk by the same organization, but these were people who had not been there when the first talk was done, we kind of pushed for it never to be done again at UCL. The point being here that they were thrust into this cultural battle, even though their motivation, what they were looking for was their identity component. Well, what is the Muslim position on evolution? And the only thing they could find was Harun Yahya, but that triggered a whole reaction to that. I can give you another anecdote regarding that, and that is one of the students who was helping me with these interviews. She said that biology professor, she was in the class, she's a medical student, and the professor came in and says, are there any creationists in the class? And she said, I hope there are no creationists. Are there any creationists in the class? And she says, I raised my hand. And she said, immediately the whole class turned against her. And they treated me like a fool. Now, she said, I thought the professor was asking an honest question. She said, are there any creationists in the class? I believe that everything in the world is created by Allah. So I'm a creationist. She was not familiar with the creationist definitions that are the way it is used here in the US and in UK and in other places. She said, creation, of course I'm a Christian. Everything is created by God, even if it's by evolution. So I'm a creationist. But her point was that when she raised the hand, she said, I thought a professor is coming in to ask this question. He asked, are there any creationists? I raised my hand. She said, then I was treated as a fool. Okay. So, just last thing. We have been talking about creationism here in the US as well. And yes, there are creationists that are here. But one of the key points is there is a key differential between Muslims in Europe and creationists here in the US, and that is power. The creationists here in the US actually hold a lot of power, even though I would say that scientific community is still much more powerful than them, but nevertheless, in terms of political power, they hold that. And second and key component is that the terms of the debate here in the US and versus the Islamic creationism debates in Europe are different because it's the insider-outsider narrative. Here, what evangelicals are saying, our values are the ones that are the real American values. And other people, the East Coast or the coastal folks, bring in secularism and other things. In Europe, it plays into the immigrant sentiment. It's a different one. It's a different context that it comes in. Okay. So I'm not going to go through that, how to actually deal with this particular issue. But I am going to just end with one of the big questions in all of that. And in some sense, that is central, and that is, who speaks for Muslims? So even when you're asking this question, like, okay, so is there a position of evolution on Islam? Or is this student asking, where should we look for? Well, in Islam, you don't have a papal-like authority structure, like in Catholicism, at least in the Sunni version of Islam. And so there indeed is a battle in terms of who defines Islam. But what's going on, and partly because education levels have really reached at sort of like maximum level in the last 20 to 30 years, and we are already seeing the impacts in, for example, the Arab Spring and various kinds of springs that took place. This is the indication of what's going on in terms of Muslims trying to interpret modernity, trying to interpret their religion in a scientific age. So there are these vibrating debates taking place. And in 2013, this was an event in England which I actually attended as an audience member, I flew in just for that. It was called Have Muslims Misunderstood Evolution? It was fascinating because the panelists included an evolutionary biologist. He's from McGill University, Ihab Abu Haif. She's a biological anthropologist in the US. And then there was, this is a theologian who kind of is lukewarm about human evolution. And here is a physicist slash religious scholar who was subjected to death threats way back. Again, he came in, he defends evolution. And then Harun Yahya person was actually on Skype from there. And this was a fascinating debate, all day section. There were 800 people in the audience. And they were all kinds of reactions. So do I have an answer to that? No. But I think I want to present this picture, this complex picture of even when we talk about Islamic creationism just in Europe, there are far more things that are taking place than just Islam or creationism. Thank you very much, and I'll just like this work is supported by National Science Foundation and also ICE, the good ICE here, and some of the papers that are related to this particular work. So thank you very much.
So, if there are questions, I ask that the microphone be used. Well, I have quite a few. But somebody from the audience, questions?
Salman, thank you very much. I much appreciated the context particularly. And one of our own studies looked at particularly the history of the thought of the Islamic world or the Orientalists. And there was this whole school of Orientalism that grew up in the last century. Yes? So like, hey, these Oriental people, they stopped thinking when the Arabian tales were written and nothing's happened since, right? A certain amount of racism, both professional and academic, in terms of how Eastern peoples were viewed. And it seems as if that has still there. It still exists. And it's been somewhat exacerbated by, you mentioned your title, The Clash of Civilizations, in that famous book, and that view. And that view has been, again, reinforced to some extent with the rise of ISIS and that conflict. And comment a little bit about that racist basis that exists, I see.
Well, thank you for that question. And like anything else, it has a complex history. So two things I should mention, that even with the British, since I'm right now deeply embedded in that context, the work that I'm doing here. So within the British context in South Asia, for example, earlier on, late 18th and early 19th century, the racism wasn't as this kind of competitive context. The racism was not that much overt, because there was also this that fantasy, or this view of the Orient as rich and fantasy, like as you mentioned, the Arabian Nights and things like that. So there was one component of Orientalist studies which didn't necessarily have a racist component, but it still presented it as a different, right, as a different thing. Just last month, there is a new book that has come out, and it looks, I mean, I've just started reading it. It looks fantastic. The reviews are excellent. It is the idea of the Muslim world. So we talk about a clash of civilization. This idea is centered on this thing that there is this civilization, the West, and there is this civilization called the Muslim world, right? But what's interesting is in that book, it's an intellectual history book. And what it argues is that, well, this particular invention of the Muslim world was actually part of the colonial project. So if you were to talk about 200 years ago, nobody would be mentioning, even in the Muslim world, and again, I'm using it in quotes, like, there is a Muslim world. There were the Ottomans, sure, then the Mughals, the Safavids, there were all these people. There were all these struggles between that. But they didn't see themselves as necessarily as part of this Muslim world that is treated in clash of civilizations. In fact, it's interesting, again, with the British context, that many people were actually, even with the British colonialism, people thought that the British Empire, the Victorian Empire, was actually a Muslim empire because it had the largest Muslim population in there, right? Now, this is absolutely fascinating. Like, we don't actually talk about that, but in the 19th century, for a while, it was considered, and there is conversation between the Ottoman Sultan and the Queen Victoria in those contexts that, that you are the Muslim emperor of India and things like that, right? So again, it was at that time when people are looking at the invention, a lot of things changed in the late 19th century, and I think in our world which we live today is pretty much shaped by those changes. One of the things that happened was when we talk about the creation of, I mentioned science. Science got professionalized in the 19th century. And in fact, the term science, people can trace exactly to the date, the year when it was first used, and I think it was 1848. That was the first time scientist was used, and because previously they were natural philosophers, and their domain was different compared to the current scientific disciplinary domains. There was no geology, there was no astronomy. It was a much broader content of natural philosophy, or you were a natural historian, right? So when science and the scientists, the term came in, and scientists and natural philosophers didn't like it, and they used actually scientist as a pejorative. The journal Nature didn't use scientist until the early 20th century. Okay. So this categorization took place. And again, to divert to that context of Huxley-Wilberforce debate, Huxley and the young professionals, they actually took authority to a certain degree from the clerics, even though a lot of clerics were doing scientific work. But they argued, and that's where evolution was coming in. No. Only this new category of professional scientists can tell you what is right and what is wrong about the natural world. Okay? But those debates took place. Now, what's interesting is the same thing happened with, again, in the context of talking about science and religion, same thing happened with the category of religion. Religion was not the way we think about religion today. It was a much broader category. So you have historian Peter Harrison. He has a book on the territories of science and religion, in which he argues this thing that actually religion was a category that itself was invented in the 19th century. And where the colonial projects, a lot of things were about counting and categorizing. And so in India as well, you had this issue of census and other types of things trying to figure out, okay, so everything, okay, we have to put these things together. Okay, when you are doing that, you are creating categories and then putting people in to fit the category. So religion itself, and one of the great examples of it is, for example, China. Chinese religion, actually, the way we think about Confucianism and Taoism, that actually was not considered as those kind of separations before 19th century, but when the colonial powers get in, they were like, okay, we need to separate. So who are you? And the same thing they did in India, where a lot of people had mixed and matched religions. But with the British, they said, no. So when they did the census in the late 19th century, they had specific categories. You didn't have the option of other, as I'm mentioning in evolution. You didn't have those categories. And that really created these very specific definitions. Okay. So coming back, this is a very long way of coming back to it. But so this idea of Muslim world was part of that narrative. And part of this narrative was about how these people are backward. And science, and look, we are the West, and of course this started with the invasion of Napoleon. That was a big one in the psyche in Egypt, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, interestingly, in the late 19th century, there were reform movements amongst various places, amongst Muslims as well, in India, in Egypt, in the Ottoman Empire, and in Iran. And they appropriated this notion of Islamic civilizations to also talk about, no, you're talking about the British colonial thing, and say, we had this Muslim civilization back in 8th, 9th century, and we were far superior than you. Even though in 8th, 9th century, they were not talking like that there was an Islamic civilization, but it was in response to the colonial attacks on or claims of superiority that many of the Muslim reformers used the same argument, flipped it, and they said, you are getting all of these things from Muslims in the first place. And so today, and a lot of it actually, this kind of study, this notion that the Islamic Golden Age, the birth of an Islamic Golden Age to a certain degree, is also an academic field. And a lot of that research actually happened in America and the US, not in Europe, because of more deeply seated racism in there. But a lot of it happened in the mid-20th century because the American scholars were actually much more open to the idea that, yes, there was an Islamic Golden Age, so what? Yes, when we are looking at the history of science, you have to incorporate Islamic Golden Age. But Islamic Golden Age did not consider itself an Islamic Golden Age in the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries, or 12th century, or however you define it. So anyway, so yeah, so it becomes, so the clash of civilization narrative, it's very popular. Samuel Huntington wrote in Foreign Policy. It is coming from Bernard Lewis, who wrote it in an article, The Roots of Muslim Rage. These are deeply, deeply problematic articles and notions. And nevertheless, and academics in Islamic studies and Middle Eastern studies, nobody takes it seriously. In fact, it's one of those things that, it's like intelligent design, which no biologists take it seriously to debunk it. It says, everybody knows it's crap. Like, nevertheless, it is so prevalent in the popular culture, and it has gone more and more. Quotes like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris has said, like, that, I mean, Muslims are the way they are. So when you, and which is so problematic because not only they treat Muslims as monolithic, but they also treat them as unchanging. And Bernard Lewis was tracing everything to the 7th century. So I think that's where the roots of racism in that context lie. They're not easy to think about racism as the case with African Americans, for example. It's a racism that you need a second degree, second order, because the prevalent narrative is so entrenched.
I just have a question. So actually a couple, but well, the Crusades, right? The Crusades were European Christians, trying to go out to Jerusalem to battle the Muslims. So I think there is a history there already that is essential, in my view, to what's going on today. I mean, people even talk about, this is the reversal of the Crusades or something. So that's just one point I wanted to. The other one is, it's funny when the professor asked, are there any creationists in class? So there were no Orthodox Jews or any Christian literalists in the class because those people are also creationists. So every monotheistic religion has a strong conservative creationist sector, and it's really surprising that those things never come up, right? And only the Muslim question comes up, at least in Europe.
In Europe, that's the key point,
Europe,
right? Like, that's what I wanted to,
Yes.
that in Europe.
Yeah.
Because in the US, that's why I find fascinating that there are these anti-Muslim groups in the US that picked up on that story, which are aligned with the right-wing Christian groups here, but because their primary interest, the Jihad Watch, are the US based, so they didn't point out that actually there is a common ground in some sense. If you believe that story, in theory there would be a common ground with many of the conservative right-wing Republican voters to a certain degree, because both the Christian. No, they just pointed out, look what they're doing to the universities over there. So it's very interesting, yes. The crusade question, you're absolutely right. There is a history to that, but again, crusades are complicated because the alliances were not directly Muslims versus Christians. They were actually, within it, there were alliances between, yes, the Pope did send a pronouncement, I think 1096, like, that, okay, that Christians should take Jerusalem, right? So that was the key component to take back Jerusalem. But then, in the second, third, and later crusades, it was all mixed in. And just like in the Protestant wars as well, I mean, the alliances were actually political, right? So the point is not that there are no history, but there is no history between Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Of course there is, because there is a lot of interaction. But the way people define themselves in a modern way, that is 19th century constructions. In particular, regarding, for example, what you practice. That wasn't the case. I mean, if you were to ask this question, are you religious? And today we can actually answer that question in many different ways. If you were to ask this question in the 15th century, that would be a nonsensical question to somebody, and the answer would be, I'm not a priest. Because what they would consider, everybody's religious. I mean, like, so they would consider everybody's religious, and they're not talking about sort of like, the precept. And that was part of the post-Protestant Reformation or the project of modernity. That religion became more important as a concept of what you do, not of who you are to a certain degree. So, okay, so I pray 5 times. Okay, Islam is, you have to do this, this, and this. Whereas previously you were just that. And again, not to say that there were no free thinkers. Sure, they were free thinkers, but again, the way we think about the world fundamentally changed, I think, in the post-Enlightenment era. I think because of the separations. Mark Lilla, who's a philosopher, he calls it the Great Separation. And he talks about how these many different domains were separated, and including science, religion, but also politics and everything else. So once you separate those, then you start thinking of things in a different way. You say, okay, this is the religious domain. I have to answer that. Whereas previously, everything would be incorporated in much more together. And so in some sense, what's going on in the Muslim world to a certain degree, and again, I'm using the word Muslim world because as a notion that Muslim majority countries, the world that we live in today is a product of a lot of historical and philosophical debates that took place, particularly in the European context. So if you go to a university in Pakistan or in Egypt or in the US, there is no difference in terms of the subjects that are being taught. Now, there is a history, as I mentioned, scientists as a category, distribution of subjects as a category. Those were all created in the 19th century. Right? And those were a particular product of the European discussions on that. But today, what some of the discussions are taking place is that Muslims are being educated in there, but they have inherited a system where nobody had a choice in what the system is going to be. So now, more increasingly, as education is increasing, people are becoming more self-aware and assertive in terms of thinking, oh, well, wait a minute, is this the only way to think about it? And should it be the case that religion and science has to have this particular relation? Now, I happen to agree with this particular relation of a separation, for example, between science and religion. Nevertheless, I think it's a valid question if somebody asks that question because it has a historical root, not something out of divinity or something else, right? And so, yeah, so I think.
Any final question? Okay. All right, let's thank Salman again. Thank you, Salman.
Thank you very much.